My clients are either corporations. I do quite a lot of work in defense for senior military teams, and also with sports teams. Tend to be elite sports teams, but we're just more recently starting to work with a broader sort of variety of sports teams, including youth sports teams as well. And I've been doing that for about, well, I set up my company 20 years ago, so quite a long time. So you're all very welcome to this webinar. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll be able to go through some things which will be interesting for you. I'll let Sal and Henning introduce themselves, and then we'll explain to you what's going to happen, and we'll kind of push on.
Okay, thank you. Sal, you take over.
Okay, yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Salvador Rodriguez here. Sal, like to be called Sal. Someone in the U.S. rebaptized me as Sal. You know, in Mexico, I don't like the way they call Salvadors. In Mexico, they have a nickname which I don't like. So I always push the Sal better because I like it a lot. I'm a social psychologist myself. I'm a cross-cultural trainer. I've been doing this for the last almost 15 years. This year is actually 14 years, and I'm an absolute passionate of cross-cultural training. And I do think Connection Scan is a great add-on to what I do and what other trainers are doing already. So I think this is a very exciting moment, and I hope we all learn a lot and enjoy the use of this new tool with our trainees and clients.
Great, thank you. Henning.
Let me quickly take over. I'm Henning Zorn, German-born, Dutch-based, Amsterdam-based, and partially in Oaxaca as well. I have been working in organizational and team development for the last 30 years. I started to work independently with my own company in 2001. And together with Jeremy and another colleague of us, we developed Connection Scan, which we think is a great tool for teams to see what's going on within their teams in terms of relations, and helps them to improve connectedness and helps them to improve performance.
Cool. I think rather than ask each of you to introduce yourselves, because I think that we're going to get into lots of sort of strange noises, probably the best thing for us to do is just, as we go through the webinar, is to ask you to mute your microphones whilst you're not talking. But obviously, if you want to ask a question or you want to make an observation, then just unmute your microphone and feel free to interrupt us. We're very happy to be interrupted. I think what you'll find is that as we go through today, we're trying to do this in a sort of dynamic way where we're talking about how we use Connection Scan in order to stimulate, in particular, conversations from a systemic perspective. So we're going to spend some time explaining that to you. So if at some points it's not making sense, then please just interrupt.
Jump in.
I am going to say a quick hello to David. Hi, David. Nice to see you, and Greg as well. I see is joining us now. So nice to see some familiar names up here, and Salma as well. So Greg and Salma have both been involved in different projects that I've been involved with Great Teams Academy, which is one of my other interests, one of my other organizations. Right. Shall we get going?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, so if you can go, there we go. Thanks very much. Next one. Brilliant. So I just wanted to contextualize what we're going to talk about today by giving you this model. I'm going to call it the Sanafin model, but I have no idea if that's how you're actually supposed to pronounce it. So if you've got a different pronunciation of it, please share it later. This is a model which is used to help people to think about decisions that need to be made and problems that need to be solved for when you're a leader. And so what it does is it categorizes the kinds of situations you might find yourself in. So starting in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got problems which are obvious. So, you know, a lot of the things that happen to us in organizations and in teams, it's pretty obvious what the answer is. It's pretty linear, and we can see that there is a very clear cause and effect relationship. So some problems fall into that category. If we then go up to the top right hand corner, you'll see that there is a box which is about being complicated. So this is where we have cause and effect, but it requires some analysis. So there's more going on, and we need to think about it. We probably need to do some research in order to solve the problem. But nevertheless, in both of these situations on the right-hand side, there is a cause and effect which we can establish as long as we keep looking for it. Now, on the left-hand side of the model, starting at the top left-hand corner, we have a kind of problem which is a complex problem. So this is where there may be some cause and effect, but it's probably going to be multifaceted, and it's certainly not going to be obvious to us when we start out looking at the problem. And in fact, it's only when you look back at it that you say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I can see that's where this issue started. I can see what caused that. So complex problems can't be treated in the same way as obvious and even complicated problems. They require us to behave in a different way to find different kinds of solutions. And then the final box, the bottom left-hand box, is about chaos. So without going too much detail about chaos theory, I think we all would recognize that there are some circumstances when we're working with teams, when we're working in organizations, where the challenges that we face are just chaotic. There's something going on in relationships. There is no obvious cause and effect in these circumstances. And we struggle to know how to make progress. In fact, the recommendation here is that you just have to get out there and do something. And by doing something, you collect data, and that data enables you then to start to think about how you can solve it. So what we want to talk about in the webinar today is the left-hand side of this model. So we want to talk about the kinds of problems that you face when you're in a team or an organization or a department, and so a simple sort of analytical approach won't work. So the left-hand side of the model is what we're looking at. If you are here hoping to see how systemic approaches worked on the right-hand side of the model with simple kind of linear cause and effect problems, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but there are circumstances in which we simply go in and the problem is obvious, and we simply need to go in and solve the problem. But we're more interested in those situations where the problem really isn't obvious. And I'll talk a bit more about how we recognize those kinds of problems in a moment. So next slide, Henning.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh.
The way.
Yeah, it's this.
Ah.
It got stuck in one way or another.
Has it frozen?
Yeah, I'm trying to get out of the presentation, and now I'm trying to get into the presentation again.
Perhaps if you stop sharing your screen, I'll take over.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. How's that? Can everybody see that?
Yes, I think so. I can see it.
Okay, that's great stuff. So what that puts us into a situation then is of looking at team problems from two perspectives. There's the conventional linear perspective, which is person-centered. We're looking for a single cause, and often we get involved in looking at how does the personality or the attributes of an individual contribute to that situation. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with those sort of situations. You know, you're working with a team, the leader calls you in and asks you to do some coaching with them, and they'll tell you, there's this problem, this guy's a problem, he won't talk to each other, or there's a conflict between these two people, I think it's a personality clash. So those are explanations for what's going on in a team which are conventional and they're linear. They suggest that one thing is causing another. What we're here to talk about is a systemic view of the world, which is appropriate when we have complex and chaotic situations. So that's around looking at what is the system, and if we can understand the system, can we start to understand how people are interconnected with each other? And if we can start to understand interconnections, then can we start to understand the relationships? So instead of looking at the individuals, we're looking at the space in between the individuals. We're looking at what's happening in those relationships that is shaping subsequent behavior. Now mine has, here we go. So there's two, I guess, metaphors that we're considering for organizations here. So the first one is a mechanistic metaphor, where we think of an organization as being like a machine, and you can just go in and you can fix a part of that machine. You can pull it apart, you can find the broken bit, you can change it, and then you can move forward. In contrast with a systemic view, which is that an organization is a complex organism that interacts, and we need to look at the whole system in order to understand how those interactions are shaping the problem that we're there to try and solve. So that's the background and the context that we want to try and cover as we work our way through this webinar. And the next thing then is just to pause on that for a moment and explain Connection Scan to you. So I'm just going to go across to Henning at this point, who's going to talk you through this.
So what you see here is a scan we made of an organization, I think with, if I remember well, with 55 people. So you see obviously a red area and the blue area and the green area. So the red area forms the center, and the red area represents the people that are best connected within this network. So these people have lots of relationships with all the other people in this scan. On the opposite side, the blue ones are not well connected, hardly connected to the rest. Maybe they are connected to each other because that's why they are close to each other, but they are not connected to many other people in this network. So basically, there is two sets of information you can see here. Those people that are well connected, and those people that are poorly connected, and who is close to whom. Can we go to the next?
We sure can.
So what you also can do, you can put two slides next to each other. So in the left scan, you see the frequency of people, how often they are connected to each other. In the red, which is in Dutch, in the red we ask them, whom would you turn to when you have a doubt or when you have a question, which for us represents sort of the trust question, because obviously you would turn to the person in any doubt, the person you trust most. So I'm just very briefly showing you what a scan, how it looks like and what it represents. A little later we will go into a case study. Could you do the next, Jeremy? So what you here see is what we call a personal scan. There's somebody in the center. We put Mohammed Makouche in the center, and to see how he experiences his relationships to the other in his team or organization. So there are, you see 5 circles, and the one on the first line are the closest to him. So in terms of frequency of communication, they said they communicate very frequently. If you go one circle further out, those people said we communicate frequently. The third level is, well, we communicate regularly. The fifth circle would say, well, we communicate every now and then. And the fifth circle would be hardly ever or seldom or something. What is interesting is that we can phrase the questions as we want them to be phrased, the answers as well as the questions, as long as we can represent the answers in a relational way. So by distance and by color.
Okay.
Yeah, what would be the next? Oh, yeah. So, in a way, Jeremy already said we are not focusing on the people, but we're focusing on the relationship. Because we think, like in the brain, the connections between the dots, they make where performance comes into the picture. Relating to Peter Senge fifth discipline, we could say it's about the relationship. The fifth discipline is about the relationship, and that's where performance occurs. Can we move on? Because we think that organizational behavior is the result of a complex web of personal stories or beliefs or behaviors. So the organization as such is a web of what people believe in, what people tell each other, and what they consequently do with each other. We will go into that a bit deeper a little later. Next, please. So when thinking about connections, can be thought, okay, the world has changed. Organizations have to be much more agile. They have to be much more adaptive to their environment. And that's why the machine model is no longer representing most organizations in the best way. Certainly when it comes to knowledge-intensive organizations, what is important that people can influence each other, that the outside world can influence the organization rapidly, and the organization adapts. So in that sense, it's not about fixing one part of the organization when something is broken or not working 100% anymore. It's much more to facilitate the organization to understand rapid change and to adapt to it. So it's that we, in very many cases, are no longer called in to come up with a solution, but that we are called in to help people find their own solution and do that in a sustainable way so that also tomorrow they know how to respond to new situations. So we need new ways of dealing with organizations. And zooming out, rather than zooming in and being analytical, zooming out and seeing the picture in its context makes the difference there. So we, at a certain moment, we came up, it was when, for the first time, it was, I think, in 72, the world saw the picture of the planet from outside. All of a sudden, we realized that we had to do with this one planet, and it's not infinite, and our resources are neither. And the same applies for the team. So when the team sees itself from the outside, it starts to realize that there are connections are going on. More practically, we've experienced that managers said, I didn't know that he felt so left out, or that they were so connected, that they work together regularly. So for the first time, the team realizes how it actually works, how people are connected, and where are fallouts, where are hubs, where are cliques, where are silos, and so forth. And once seeing that, we can make interventions on that and help them to repair that. Next. So the problem here, however, is, and that's with zooming out, and that's exactly the picture of the world. If you can't see, you can't change. So seeing what you want to change helps you in order, and we can go to the next, in order to be able to do that, we developed an instrument that zooms out and gives you a picture of the whole system and its members. Okay.
So obviously,
take over again.
Yeah. So obviously, so far we've been talking a bit about Connection Scan and this idea of looking at the whole organization and trying to view the organization from a systemic perspective. What I wanted to come on to now was just to talk to you a little bit about our approach to systemic team coaching. So teams are very much the world in which I work, working either directly with leaders or working with the whole team. And there are different ways in which I approach that. But I guess that when I come across a team which I think is particularly stuck, a team that doesn't seem to be able to respond to input, then being able to think about it systemically gives some big advantages to me. So I thought I would tell you a bit about how I go about doing this, and I know that there are different ways of approaching working systemically, but so this is just one. So for people in teams that have got systemic problems, the experience of being in the team is a bit like riding a roller coaster. Sometimes you feel you're up and you're high and everything seems great, and then a few days or sometimes even a few hours later it seems terrible and everything's low. And you feel like you're strapped into this roller coaster. You've got no control over whether it's going up or down. You're just there on the ride. So that tends to be characterized by sort of low-grade, recurring problems within the team. You know, the kind of things like chronic conflict that has never really been addressed, politics that's going on in the background, sometimes in the foreground. It's not enough to destroy the team, but it undermines what's happening within the team. You tend to see a lot of cynicism around anything which is to do with change. And all of this combines to lead to slow, poor decision-making, lack of innovation. So with a lot of the teams that I work with, this is something that is happening in this low-grade way. It's not enough to blow the team apart, but each of these elements has a small but consistent impact on the performance of the team. And so often the manager or the leader finds it quite difficult to exactly explain to you what the problem is. And the way that they normally handle that is that they will say, this person is the problem. I've got a problem with this person. Everybody else in the team is fine, but I have a problem with this person. So the traditional view of approaching that is then to zoom in and look at it from a sort of mechanical perspective. So that's about focusing on the individual, what's happening within you. Often there'll be some kind of intervention which involves some education, some personal insight, perhaps using a sort of inventory of some type, and then some sharing and a bit of discussion. And the hope is that if we can all understand ourselves as individuals and understand that other individuals are different to us, then somehow that will help us to move forward. So it might be around personality. Quite often it's around things like conflict, using inventories that look at conflict. Sometimes it's around communication. Sometimes it's around decision-making styles. But each of these is about trying to identify a sort of singular problem and thinking, what is the intervention that can fix this, often through education. And so sitting behind that is the idea of cause and effect. And sitting behind that is that individuals are responsible for this situation, and that if the individuals could individually change, then we'd be able to improve the outcomes that we're facing. And so there's a sort of an implied and often overt blame that this is the fault of an individual, and only that individual changing is going to address the problem. And that individual is often treated separated from the context of the team. And the causes are to do with their behavior or their attributes. And we focus on giving them individual feedback. So if we flip that to thinking about it from a systemic perspective, then we're now zooming out. and we're saying, hey, let's not look at individuals, let's look at what's happening in the whole system, what's happening in the relationships between us, whose relationships are being altered, strengthened or weakened by the problem behavior that we're trying to address. What are the patterns that keep coming back, and how can we look at changing those patterns? What are the meaning? What's the meaning behind interactions? So when people interact with each other, do we know what the story is that they're using to explain what's going on? Do we adopt a shared responsibility for finding a solution? It's much easier to just pick on one or two people, but from a systemic perspective, we're trying to encourage that shared responsibility. And we see the individual as holding the problem for the team rather than being the problem within the team. So what they're doing is that they are the way in which this problem, which is in the interactions between people, is being expressed. And in actual fact, the expression of that problem is saving the team, is helping the team in some way that people are not aware of. So there's a circularity to that, and we need to look at that connectedness and that circularity, and we need to therefore look at connected feedback. So I'm trying to give you some perspective on how zooming in gives you a different view of the world to zooming out. So quick bit on what are systems, because I'm talking about systems quite a lot. So the key thing here is that a system is defined as something which is interacting, interrelated, and interdependent. So a team is a system because people depend on each other in order to produce the team or collective output. And for something to be a system, it needs to exist within a larger system, and it needs to have a purpose. For the systems overall to succeed, all the parts or all the subsystems need to be there and performing their function. So if one team is not functioning well, then there's a knock-on effect for other teams. If one sub-team's not functioning well, that might be what we're focusing on in a particular intervention, then it has a knock-on effect for everybody else. Systems respond, change in response to feedback, but they are naturally trying to be stable. And they do that by making adjustments based on that feedback. So there's a kind of interactivity and a circularity to systems. And just again, to get very geeky, but we don't need to get into this too much, there are two really fundamental loops that you see in systems. One is a reinforcing loop. So this is like a nuclear reaction where things start rolling and then it gets more and more and more. So like a snowball rolling down a hill. So what you see in some teams is that they'll go through a reinforcing loop where things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And then something changes in the system and they get into another reinforcing loop where things get better and better and better. And then they zigzag and they go back onto this roller coaster between positive and negative reinforcing loops. And the second type of loop that we see in teams are balancing loops. So this is more like, you know, if you're filling a glass of water, you adjust the tap to make sure that it doesn't overflow. And so the system is constantly readjusting itself. Keeping your body temperature through sweating or shivering is another way in which a system stabilizes itself. So with those two things happening within systems, there's a lot of interactivity that's going on. And the experience of that, though, for the individuals involved, is that they have beliefs about the system that impact the relationships within the system that lead to actions within the system. So those beliefs are shaped by my personal beliefs about the world and about this system, and also by the team beliefs about the world and about the system. So they both go together to make me as an individual think, okay, this is what's going on here. And this is how I see it play out in the relationships between people. And it's my views about what will be the impact on those relationships that causes me to choose how to behave. And I think if we just think of an example, you might be in a team meeting with some colleagues. You could be discussing something which you know is going to be a controversial issue. What do you say? Well, people don't usually just say the facts. What they do is they communicate in a way, depending on who they want to get closer to, who they think will respond badly to particular pieces of feedback or information, who they think are their allies. So they start to play a game which is around using those relationships in order to achieve something for themselves and to achieve something for other people involved in those relationships. So systemic coaching is trying to look into that space. And a fundamental tenet of it is that to understand why a person is acting in a particular way, we have to understand the relationships that are being affected within it. And that there are two principles that are always at work in systems. The first is that the system is invisible to people. So if I'm in the system, then I can't see it because I'm in it. And so my perspective on that system is it's always biased. I can only see it from my view. I can see my relationship with you. I can observe parts of your relationship with other people, but I can't see how all of those fit together. And without system visibility, I'm not able to draw some conclusions about my part in it, and so I'm not able to make changes. And the second principle when you're coaching with teams systemically is what's called the positive connotation. And so that's about saying what people do in teams is not actually try to derail the team. What they're trying to do is save the team. People are experiencing something which is making them anxious, which they're worried about, which is leading to a certain amount of fear within them. That might be fear of conflict. It might be fear of change. It could be an anxiety around my status or the status of the team as a whole. So there are different aspects in which that fear can play out. And so the proposition of working systemically is that what I do is to save the team from having to face something that's worse. And because that becomes locked in this recurring pattern, that solution is no longer fit for purpose. So at some point, what I did worked and it was useful, and but now it no longer is useful because it's just going round and round and round. So if we want to try and understand what's going on and we want to change a system, then we need to try to understand what is it that the people who are involved in the system are trying to save their colleagues from. Now, that might sound all very abstract, but if I just try and make it a little bit more concrete very quickly, I worked with a team a few years ago and they had an issue which was a boss who was very demanding, wanted work done very quickly, set very high standards. The whole team bought into that, but the boss would tend to come to them on a Friday afternoon and say, I need a presentation for Monday morning. So sudden rush, work over the weekend, high levels of anxiety and stress. And what people did was that they worked over the weekend. And why did they work over the weekend? Because they were terrified that if they raised this issue, there would be a conflict which would explode, that they would never be able to put it all back together, that the whole thing would fall apart. So there were high levels of anxiety about the conflict, which made deciding to work your Friday night and all day through Saturday and into Sunday seem like a rational, logical conclusion. That was the right thing to do. But obviously it creates lots of knock-on stress and consequences afterwards. So the objective with systems coaching is to try and get some insights into that system so that we can enable people to have new perspectives on it so that they can then start to think about what are those underlying beliefs and how can we start to change them. So what we wanted to do now was just to switch across to an example of a scan, which Henning, I think, is now going to share with us, and to talk that through with you so that you can see what this means in practice. You able to share, Henning?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yep, good.
Yeah.
That's up.
Okay, good. So let me give you some introduction to this team. A team I worked with a couple of years ago. We are in the technical field. This is an international team. There are 5 nationalities or 5 countries involved. We are dealing with a Dutch organization who's building semiconductors or chips. there is a Korean league, there is an American group, there is a Dutch part, there is a French part, and there is a German part. These people have to work together as they all have their own expertise in relation to the chip that has to be built, and they bring in their specific competence. Hans-Georg is a German guy who's based in Holland to make things more complicated. He's the team leader, obviously, which speaks for itself if you look at the picture, sort of. Most of the people are fairly well spread around him, you could say. But we were approached because Hans-Georg experienced that there was a slowdown in communication. It took too long to exchange experience and exchange new steps in the process. And in order to speed that up, we could get people together for 2 days. So let me give you some more background to this. Léon is based in France. He's the French project leader. He has access to the client. And if I now look here in the dual view, let me do it this way. So what we see here is, to the left-hand side, we see the current frequency of communication. To the right-hand side, we see the desired frequency of communication. And in fact, you could say, though the positions are different, that's related to the algorithm, and the viewer chooses the position by itself. What is important is the distance and the color. So not whether somebody is top left or right under, because that could have the same meaning in a way, as long as the distance are the same. So so there is not much difference in that, which is interesting. If I now look into...
Just before we go to the next one, actually, I just wanted to explain a little bit about what you're looking at here. So this is the Connection Scan viewer. So the way that Connection Scan works is that once you have access, you can log into a portal that enables you to set up a questionnaire. And in the questionnaire, you can put in whatever questions you want. But there are some questions that we use very often, and we call them the MIT questions because they come from some research that was conducted at MIT into the importance of communication on team effectiveness. And one of the questions from the MIT batch is around how frequently do people communicate with each other? And so that's the one that you can see here on the left-hand side. So this is a really nice, simple team. It's a very simple scan for us to look at, which is why we picked it for this explanation. You can have scans which have several hundred people on them, and which you can zoom in and zoom out in all sorts of different ways. But this is a nice, simple one. And what you see here on the left-hand side is what we would call a hub and spoke team. So we've got at the hub, Hans-Georg, who is the boss. We've got Marcus. I'm not quite sure what Marcus's role is, but he's kind of closer to Hans-Georg. And then we've got some people on the outside in a sort of outer circle, Valerie and Sun Hai, who are clearly communicating less than others with the team. So the first thing to notice about this is Hans-Georg has no idea how other people are communicating with each other. So when he came to Henning and said, I want to talk to you about communication because we have some issues with it, he didn't know what it looked like. So just being able to show him these relationships is already an insight for him that he'd never had before. But equally, if we put ourselves into the positions of others, such as Sun Hai, she doesn't know what her position is in relation to other people. As far as she's concerned, she might be a quieter person, but she doesn't know how much other people are communicating with each other, and she doesn't know who's communicating with who.
Now, the interesting part here, for interrupting, I'm a corporate anthropologist, so obviously I look at this picture through a cultural lens. So knowing a bit about Korea, I know there is hierarchy. So I know that Se-hee is a project leader and Sun-hee is a specialist in her field, and I assume that indeed communication has to go through her project leader before it comes to the rest of the team. While Se-hee, and that's what I found out in the course of the process, is running a couple of projects. So he is not always available for her or for this project because he's involved in many others. Or another lens I could look at. At a certain point, I found out Valerie, who's blue down here, her English is not up to speed, so to say. She's a bit shy about that, so she would not easily connect with other colleagues. So from a mechanic point of view, I indeed would say, okay, maybe she should have some training in English, and maybe I should tell Se-hee that Sun-hee certainly, as she is a very capable and well-educated person, she certainly could communicate directly to the team. The problem is the question is whether that solves the problem. Sorry.
So what you tend to find with teams that are stuck in systemic loops is that they have explanations like the explanation that Henning just gave us. And so if you went and talked to Hans-Georg about why he isn't addressing this issue of Sun-hee being more distant and less communicated with, then his explanation may well be because actually they're Korean and I don't want to disrupt the hierarchy. But looking at it from a systemic perspective, we're asking some different questions. So we want to try and get to understand what are the stories that people are currently using to explain what's going on in the team, and how fit for purpose are those stories? So are they really the reason why there isn't change, or is there something else that might be able to explain it? Henning, can you just have a look at the importance question on the right side?
Allow me first to do something else, because what is interesting is if I now compare the desired frequency and I go into Sun-hee's personal view, for instance, and in Sun-hee's other's view, you would see that this is what she thinks, how she desires to be connected. So basically you could see here that she's pretty okay with how things are going, because she says, well, I communicate through Se-hee to Hans-Georg. He's the project leader. He should have the information. And the rest of the team is less important to me. Well, if you look at Se-hee and how others would like to be connected to her, you see that there is a couple of people who want to be much closer to her and say, well, I need you, I need your information.
So I think this is a good example of how Connection Scan allows you to have different perspectives on a system. So if I'm going and trying to work systemically with a team, and I just go and talk to people, then I don't have any of these insights around similarities and differences. And all of these insights are about how people are connected with each other. In this particular questionnaire, we're using communication as a proxy for connectedness. But we could be asking other questions. We could be asking questions about trust. We could be asking questions about conflict, such as, who is most likely to agree with you about something? Who are you most likely to seek help from, and so on. So we can get at this from lots of different ways. But once we've looked at the overall picture, then we can zoom in on each individual and we can start to see things from their perspective. Sorry, Henning, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You wanted me to swap to something else?
Yeah, can you take the right-hand view to be importance?
The overall.
And let's zoom back out to the overall, okay. Yeah. So I guess the other thing that you can see here is that it's really easy to navigate your way around the scan. And because the scans are very quick for people to do, it also means that you can take a scan, you can then do another scan later on, you can do another scan, and you can make comparisons between scans and so on. So it allows you to really investigate the data with the team. So should we talk a bit about the sorts of interventions that we might do if we were to look at working with this team?
Yeah, so in a way you could say the classical way would be indeed education, as you mentioned before, and to say, okay, let's go into cultural differences, for instance, or let's into communication styles, or let's do some communication exercises where people connect more easily, so that let's do some team building so that people get more comfortable with each other, even if their English is not appropriate, and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but to take a more systemic view, what sort of things would you be thinking of doing?
Well, I think we could ask some circular questions, like, let me see, Valerie, how do you think Hans-Georg experiences the team communication? Or Jack, how do you think, and so forth. So circular questions are questions.
So just to explain to you what circular questions are an approach which is developed from systemic family therapy. And the idea of a circular question is that we try and ask a third person to talk about, give their perspective on something that's going on between two other people. So in this situation, we might start with Hans-Georg and Sun-Hee. Or we might decide that actually it would be better for us to ask someone about the relationship between Se-Hee and Sun-Hee. And we're asking questions which fall into different kinds of categories. So sometimes we ask questions which are about difference. So we might ask a question of, say, Randall. We might say, who do you think is closer to Hans-Georg, Se-Hee or Sun-Hee, and why? Why do you think that they're closer? So we're asking questions about who's closer, who's more distant. Sometimes we'll ask questions about values. So I might ask a question of Petter, who seems to be out at the edge of this scan and not really involved if we're taking a conventional view. But Petter has an insight. So I might say, Petter, who do you think is most concerned about communication within the team? And what is the impact of that communication on them? So I'm asking questions which are trying to bring in some different perspectives. We might ask questions about relationships. So for instance, we might say to Leon, first of all, if the team were to communicate more openly and more equally, whose relationships do you think would change the most? Can you name two people who you think's relationship would change the most? So that's quite neutral. We're saying change the most. We're not saying get better or get worse. We're just saying change the most. And after we've asked Leon, then I would probably go on and ask everybody in the team exactly the same question. So we're getting different perspectives on what's going on. And that gives us the opportunity to either start looking at things from a perspective in which we're making interpretations, where we're drawing some hypotheses about what's going on. or it enables us to just allow the team to start making those hypotheses. So in this situation, it may be, well, actually, at some point in the past, say he has got really angry because someone interfered with the hierarchy. It may be that Hans Gerg is quite timid about forming relationships with certain kinds of people. And so there's experience within the team of a conflict because of something that happened in those relationships with Hans Gerg. So something that's happened in the past that is still influencing the way that we do things and is the real story, the real rationale for people either for people's behavior now and the way that they are maintaining that behavior so that they can't change within the team.
The most interesting part, I mean, indeed, you can ask from all sorts of perspective. You could ask the team, okay, what do you think your client would want to change in your team? But given the fact that we see how people are related, you could also ask, okay, Jack or Randall or whoever, where would be your ideal position in this team to be more effective? So what we could do, we could place people in the space, in the room we are together, according to the scan they see in front of them. We could ask them to bring their chair and to sit down there and to say, okay, this is your current position. Pick one, where would you be ideally? So let's assume we are asking Jack, where would you be ideally in your team? And then he might change his position. We leave the chair and we put him in that position, or he puts himself in that position. And once that position is established, he could look around where he is. And then we could even ask him, so Jack, if you now would be able to move others into the ideal position for you, where would you move them? So in a very physical way, you let people experience how they could change the team. Jeremy, take over. You want to say?
Yeah, so, well, just because this is an approach which works really well because it's physical, it's visual, it enables people to really enact what's happening in the scan. The scan gives them a start point, and then they can start to look at how they might want to change that. And once you start moving one person, then there's a consequence for another person, and so everybody has to start moving around. What often happens with teams is that they end up in a circle. And they're saying this would be the ideal communication for us, where everybody is communicating equally. And if that's where they end up, and actually, incidentally, that's where the research suggests that they should end up, then the challenge is now just how to get moving on that. But what you've done in a relatively short period of time, because you've started to get them to think about the whole system, all of them interconnected in that system, because you've shown it to them visually, in a relatively short period of time, you've enabled them to really shift their thinking about what's going on within their system and what could bring about change and what might be the benefit, not just for me individually, but for everybody who's in this team. So that's why we think Connection Scan has a huge amount of power when we start to use it in systemic coaching approaches.
And in a way to anchor that, we then could ask, okay, if this is your ideal position, what holds you from being there? Or
yep.
To ask it more positively, what could you do to make that happen? So
yep.
What agreements can we make with each other in terms of processes, in terms of agreements, in terms of meetings, in terms of to make that happen and to move towards this ideal picture of the team.
So I'm conscious of the time. So if you will just share back, we'll stop sharing and I'll start sharing.
Yeah. It's in your hands again.
Excellent, thank you. Okay. So this has been a whistle-stop tour. We've tried to use the example of some team coaching with a particular team to show you how Connection Scan works and hopefully give you some insights into that. I guess our view is that when people see the whole system for the first time, it changes their view of that system forever. And without us having to even know what it was that was the real problem, we're able to intervene in a way that shifts the system forwards. So we're giving people new insights, new understandings, and new possibilities. And Connection Scan does that for us, and why we think it's powerful, because it allows us to look at those connections. It allows you to zoom in and out. You can look at individuals. You can look at the whole system. You can respond to people's questions. You can focus what you look at on whatever you like to, because you can write lots of different types of questions around things like communication, trust, support, and beliefs. And it gives you this entry point into a systemic investigation. So a few quick points about the system, about the scans. They're value free. You don't have to interpret them. They take everyone's opinion into account. They're a shared evaluation. They're dynamic, so we can keep working on them. They let people see something for the first time, so there's always a, oh, I didn't realize that kind of moment for the team. They enable people to modify those connections, and it is participative change rather than command and control. So people are doing this to themselves, for themselves. We are running some training programs for Connection Scan. There's links to the information about this. What we do in the training is that we work our way through how you use Connection Scan and how you can use it in your business, but also how can you work with it systemically. So it's a combination of helping you to understand systemic approaches to working with teams and to use this tool, which will give you a real head start compared to other people who might be trying to work in that way. We've got courses which are coming up in the UK in Brighton and also in Mexico City in March. So if anybody's interested in those, then we'd be really happy to hear from you.
Maybe a small business point. What you sell scans to your clients at a certain price, depending on the country. We think they are very affordable, and that's the feedback we get from our clients. Compared to other tools, we are cheaper. But within the course, when you do the certification course, you get 100. How do we call them?
Credits.
100 credits, so that you can ask 100 questions, and you can ask them for free. So basically, with your first client, you get a return on investment into the certification course.
Okay, good. I'm very conscious that we are just about out of time.
Well done.
But I did just wonder whether anybody had any questions that they wanted to ask. If you do, please unmute and fire away. Excellent. It's always nice to have silence. Yeah. Jutta, please.
Henning, Jeremy, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I've just I'm fascinated to see the link between the questions and the visual aspect, and it reminds me of work one does with kind of PRA methods where it's much simpler. And then a question I was reminded, when one sees the outlying persons and you work with the team and you present them the visual image of them actually outlining what's happened to me before, and I wondered whether you have the same experience and then how you manage that the visuality of it can actually be dodgy, because people may feel actually quite hurt when they see how much of an outlying position they're taking. And of course you're coaching, you're accompanying, but it also depends on how much time you have afterwards to follow through with them. And then the tendency, precisely what you say about the circularity, then there's almost like a group pressure. I want to be part of it. So of course we're all going to be equal. We're all going to be we're going to try to go for a circle, and it's I'm not sure how the honesty of the answers can then be can be managed afterwards. So it can be quite difficult to manage. How do you?
So I think there's a couple of questions in there. Mm-hmm. So the first one is what is the response of people when they see themselves isolated from the team? And I think there's a couple of points here from my perspective. The first one is that you need to set up your workshop so that people have thought through. So I would typically show some example scans which aren't their team, and I talk about what those scans might mean. And we talk about how there isn't a good or a bad place to be. So I could equally be asking the question of Hans Gerg in that picture of, what are the dangers and the disadvantages of being so much of a hub in a team. Now, so that's the first thing. So the way that you set it up is obviously very important to the way that people experience it. The second thing is that people already know they're there. So they, in my experience, there is an apprehension you will get that response, but there isn't that response. And I can give you an example from quite a big group that I did this with not so long ago. There was one person who was right out on the edge, and one of the things that we said to her is, what's it like there? And she said, actually, standing here, I see it. It's not very nice where I'm standing. We said, well, where would you like to move to? And she moved to somewhere else in the team, and everybody said, yeah, we'd be really happy to have you here. And there was a lot of very rapid change around the experience for that person. But she already knew she was there. She wasn't surprised to see the scan because obviously she'd filled it in.
Interesting enough, very often the manager is surprised. So the team leader, because he's not aware of it. So we had cases where the team leader wanted to protect his people from seeing the scan because he felt that this isolation should not be seen by everybody, while the person themselves said, yeah, but I'm very aware of that because I filled in the questions. I mean, yeah.
So the important thing for them is to try and help them to make some new meaning out of where they are. And I think that's the sort of the coaching role in this. So it's not enough to simply show to people where they are. That might be a catalyst for change. Yeah. But we want to help them to make meaning out of it and to have some understanding and to think about what new meaning might be placed in that. So I've also worked with a team where the guy on the outside was like an internal audit guy. And actually his job was to be on the outside. So we looked at the scan and everyone said, oh, what's it like being there? He said, hey, this is great. This is where I belong. I can't be too close to you guys. I have to check on you. I'm internal control. So, sometimes I had a story in my mind, which was that this was inappropriate, and actually the story was quite different. So a lot of us have this view that central is better, which is an interesting view, that to be in the middle of it is a good thing. And so in sessions, I would always challenge that view and ask the question, why would you assume that? Mm-hmm. Does that answer both the questions, or was there a... Oh, yes. I know. The second question was, what if you get people to do it again, and don't you get some kind of conformity around, where they some social desirability rather in their responses? And the answer to that is yes. I mean, there's a risk that you will, and so I think whether you do it again depends on how successful the session was. So if the session was successful, people leave with a lot of energy. So they've seen something new and they get excited about the possibilities of it, because they'd felt a bit trapped before, because this is not a fully functioning team. This is a team that has this roller coaster ride problem, and we're unlocking something there. And then what I think you get, again, in my experience, is a lot of honesty in how people respond, because they don't want to try and cover something up. they want to see whether things are different from everyone's perspective. But if I was with a team that I didn't feel I'd got to any kind of breakthrough, then there might be some other interventions I'd want to do first before I remeasured.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Okay. Any other questions before we close?
Well, anyway, if you don't have a question right now, I can imagine that rethinking that other questions come up. Well, please send us a mail and we are happy to answer. But I don't want to get in your way to answer a question now, but just as an add-on.
Okay, that's great. So if anybody would like a copy of the presentation, then we'd be happy to share it with you. Obviously, we've all been in touch with you via email. We're not super high-tech yet and automated, ready for thousands of people on our call. So just send us an email, any questions. If you're interested in finding out more about the training, we can provide that to you as well. And if you'd like the presentation, please do let us know. This is the first time that we've run a webinar like this. So, you know, for me personally, it's quite exciting. I've enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to all of you. We're really interested in your feedback about it too. So, you know, we're very aware that we're not doing it perfectly, and maybe there's some things which have not been so great from your experience, but please, you know, help us, share that with us and let us know how we can improve this experience, because it's something that we're going to do more of moving forwards. And so last word from me is to thank you all very much for giving us an hour and 8 minutes of your time and participating in this. And I hope it's been a worthwhile hour for you. Certainly from my perspective, it has been. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you very much, Henning. I think it was great.
I only can echo what Jeremy said and what Zelda said. Thanks for having us. Thanks for listening to us. Please let us know whatever question or feedback you have. And I wish you a very pleasant weekend.
A very good morning, afternoon, evening, weekend, wherever you are in the world. And thanks for dialing in. And Greg,
Thank you very much.
I'll connect with you separately, Greg.